Good afternoon, James. It's good to see you again. Today is May 17th, 2022, and this conversation builds upon the conversation we had back in January for the CRS Oral History Project Revisited. This is our second and probably final conversation together. Because of the role you played during your service at CRS in the mid-'80s to early '90s, some of the questions are not applicable to you that we've asked some of other oral history participants. So let's start with this set of questions. Were you engaged at CRS in providing conciliation or mediation services for street or community-oriented processes? And what I mean by that is, did you engage in conciliation or mediation during protests when you were on the ground?
No, not necessarily.
Well, when you say not necessarily, can you expand on that?
Well, I did respond to a couple of situations in New York to assist the New York field office, but that was basically marshaling and crowd control kinds of assignments.
And when you were engaged there, what were your goals for involvement?
Basically, again, marshaling and crowd control.
Okay.
The New York field office had several events back in those days, the late '80s, early '90s, that were that they were engaged in, and they needed some additional staff to provide coverage for the events. So several of us from headquarters, went and supported that effort.
And when you were marshaling, and my internet connection's unstable, so let me know if you can't hear me. What were you doing while you were marshaling? Were you observing protesters? Were you keeping protesters separate from one another? Can you tell me more about it?
Yeah, both. Observing the protesters, observing the behavior of the various groups, ensuring that the kinds of instructions that were given initially were being adhered to, making sure that law enforcement was aware of our presence and our role in the event. So those are the kinds of things that we were involved in.
If you were working with advocates, did you see your role as a consultant to help make protests more effective, or did you see your role as neutral to keep people safe?
Neutral to keep people safe, and in support of the field staff's role, which was, of course, to provide the support to the organizations that were they were there to assist, to keep peace, and to allow the event to take place.
Did you ever try to end or redirect protests, or try to deter violence during protests or demonstrations?
No, not me personally. Mm-mm.
Okay. Did you ever train protesters or advocates in order to help them more effectively and safely advocate for their interests and needs?
No.
All right. In this capacity, you were primarily taking cues from the staff in the New York regional office or the New York office about how to interact and engage with protesters and law enforcement. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's move on to broadly some of your work typically in a typical case, knowing that no case, in particular the ones you have described in the prior oral history, is typical. So can you perhaps describe some of the roadblocks you might encounter in your efforts to work with parties effectively and how you would overcome those roadblocks. And again, I recognize in this context that you are providing typically technical assistance to the conciliators who were working on the ground. So you were providing technical assistance specifically based on your law enforcement expertise. So in that context, what type of roadblocks might you encounter in a typical case?
Well, thinking back, normally the conciliator would have their casework and their needs for technical assistance already identified. So when they came to OTAS, the Office of Technical Assistance and Support, for help, they would pretty much have their needs addressed, and the resources that they requested from us would be provided. So there was not necessarily any roadblocks that we had to overcome, because we were providing the resources to the field.
And tell me a little bit more, and you have in the prior oral history, but tell me again about some of the resources you did provide in the field.
Yeah, well, again, if the field needed to have expert advice and counsel, and we in OTAS provided that resource, whether it was provided by us individually or whether we identified other consultants throughout the country to provide those consultants supports for them. If it was some expertise that was being required of the conciliator or the mediator, and we didn't have that in-house, we would know where to go get it, whether it was with from a administration of justice standpoint, whether it be from a police chief or superintendent of corrections, or based on the casework itself, we would assist in determining in securing those resources that would help that conciliator resolve that casework.
So you would leverage your connections within the law enforcement community, if necessary, to bring an outsider in. So let's just say I'm based in Columbus, Ohio, and if there were a demonstration or I were the conciliator on the ground here in Columbus and I needed law enforcement expertise, I would send a message to the national office and say, hey, look, I need help from law enforcement. I need technical assistance. And you would typically provide that help. But if you couldn't, or if it was something specific, you would then leverage your contacts to bring someone else in from that you had a relationship with into the conversation. Yes. Am I understanding that right?
That's right. That's right. That's right. And we would utilize our relationships with law enforcement organizations, such as the Police Research Forum, PERF, or NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, or the IACP, the International Association of Chiefs of Police. You know, those are organizations that we constantly were involved with and supported, and they supported us. We attended their conferences. We associated with their memberships. So we had very good working knowledge of the capabilities that those organizations provided to their membership. And we were able to draw on those relationships to assist our casework in the field.
Okay. So you leveraged those relationships, you understood the capacity that you yourself had and the capacity that those organizations can have. So could you, if you can you give me an example where you leverage someone at NOBLE or IACP to bring technical assistance in?
Okay, give me an example. We had a a situation in Greensboro, again, North Carolina. This was a situation with extremists, extremist group. I think it was Klan activity, and of course, the chief of the chief of police in, I think, Charleston, South Carolina at the time, was one of our consultants. And based on his prior experience with that same type of extremist activity, we secured his support to come to Greensboro to work with the chief there and his staff in addressing the concerns that they had around security issues. So again, our knowledge of that chief in South Carolina and his involvement with that kind of activity gave us opportunity to share that information with the new chief there in Greensboro. And it worked out quite well.
So this is a great illustration of using similarly situated communities in the same state that may have similar problems with or similar issues with respect to white supremacists, using the information and knowledge base from one community and sharing it with the other. Did you, so you went from chief to convey information. The chief in the community that provided the technical assistance, did you have to pay them? Did you just make the request and use your relationships through ICP, if you recall?
Well, this was a more of a mutual aid type of agreement, in that they weren't in the same state. They were members of the same organization. We were all members of the same organization. So there was no compensation involved in that arrangement. Because of our relationship with one another, the supporting chief was able to provide his travel and assistance without any need or request for compensation.
Okay, and now I'm embarrassed about my geography problems in the Carolinas, so I'm sorry about that. But
Charleston is to the south of Greensboro.
Gotcha. So that makes sense. So you use these chief to chief, member to member relationships to provide technical assistance to one another. Thank you for sharing that. When you were dealing with, it sounds like you had experience providing technical assistance as communities addressed issues with respect to white supremacists. Can you tell me more about that work? Were there any strategies that were particularly effective from CRS's or your perspective with respect to dealing with white supremacists or other similarly situated groups?
Oh yeah, well, you know, back in the mid 80s to early 90s, you know, a lot of that activity was we had a lot of involvement with CRS casework. We had marches, some adverse activity that conciliators went in on. Did I tell you about the one incident down in, I think it was Forsyth, Georgia? Did I tell you about Forsyth, Georgia?
I don't think so.
Forsyth, Georgia. Forsyth, Georgia, Cummings, Georgia is a town in Forsyth. Uh, Cummings was what you call a sundown town.
Mhm.
And it had a reputation of making sure that blacks are out of town but by sundown. If not, they would receive retribution. Uh, uh, a member of the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Hosea Williams, I think he was the president of the Decatur, Georgia SCLC at the time. He started a march through Forsyth to bring attention to the fact that Forsyth was one of the last counties in the nation that was segregated. And he wanted to march through Forsyth to Cummings to bring attention to the fact that Cummings was a sundown town. He started the march, and of course the Klan interrupted the march, pelted the marchers with bottles and bricks, and of course injured the marchers, and of course that became a national story. The newspaper and the TV got it, and of course my director, Dear Pumper again, sent the OTS staff, Wally Warfield and myself and several others from headquarters down to Forsyth. Ozell Sutton and his team came up from Atlanta, and we got the governor to provide support with the Highway Patrol and the National Guard, and created a line of protection throughout Forsyth County for Hosea Williams and his marchers to proceed and bring closure to the march through Forsyth and to Cummings.
So your role in providing technical assistance there was that to interface with the law enforcement that provided that protection for the protest, for the demonstrators, or what other roles did you play there?
Yeah. Well, my role as a law enforcement official was to again work with the local law enforcement and the Highway Patrol in ensuring that their role in providing that line of coverage for the marchers to proceed orderly through the county was effective.
So in any of your engagements, how did you measure the success of your work in providing technical assistance as part of the team?
Well, again, the measure of success is the success of the mission itself, the effectiveness of the services that we provided, and the of course the quality of the service that was provided or that we provided. All of those things aided in the resolution of the issue that were being addressed by the mediator or the conciliator at the time.
So in this time period, the country, perhaps it wasn't as polarized politically as it is now. Maybe it was. Your institutional memory certainly would be better than mine from this time period. How does political polarization impact your work as providing technical assistance through CRS?
I don't think the nation as a nation was as polarized politically as it is today. I don't think we had the kinds of polarization throughout the communities the way that we have today. And that allowed us as third party dispute resolvers an opportunity to draw from those elements within the community that were supportive of the kinds of resolve that that we were trying to bring to a community. Community stability is very, very important. And of course you had community leaders and citizenry back in the day that didn't buy into some of the foolishness from, especially from extremism that that existed. There was no such thing as QAnon. There was no such thing as Proud Boys. There was no such thing as Oath Keepers. I mean, those kinds of phenomena just didn't exist back then. I mean, we had extremisms. You know, we had the Klan. The Klan was the most prominent, and of course, they were the most violent, but they weren't as tolerated in the broader society as extremism is today. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. What do you think has contributed to that tolerance for extremism from your perspective as a former conciliator or former CRS technical assistance provider?
Well, I think it's there's a lot of fear in society today, a lot of uncertainty about a lot of uncertainty about life itself, about future, and there's a lot of hate, and those kinds of combinations bring about a bad result. Bill, you and I talked back January the 5th. I don't think either one of us, I know I did, expect the very next day to be as dramatic as it was. I mean, in our nation's capital. I mean, that's a prime example of what I'm talking about. And we as a nation have gotten to a point where we don't trust leadership. We don't trust leadership at the highest level. We don't understand how it is that our democracy, as it's supposed to protect all people and all facets of society, is somewhat being compromised. So yeah, we are living in a different time.
So I want to, January 6, 2021, obviously there was a transition taking place at that time. And I want to talk to you about changes in federal administrations. I know you were in CRS during the transition from Reagan to Bush 1, and I think we're leaving CRS from Bush to Clinton. But do you have any recollection, or can you describe how changes in administrations impacted your work at CRS?
Not at all. Not changes in administration. I mean, we were pretty much, even though we went from Republican and from Reagan to Democrat. Let me see. What was it? Reagan
went from Reagan to Bush. So
Reagan
two
to Bush,
Republican
and
to
then
Republican.
Reagan to Bush, and then Bush to Clinton.
Mm-hmm.
But those turned between Reagan and Bush 1. there was no real significant changes because of this. The parties in power was the same, and many of the second and third tier officials that were presidential appointees remain the same or came in under those administrations. Again, I was there in the beginning of the Clinton administration, and there was very little change in the way that the government operated. And certainly, even though there was a difference between the presidencies, changing from Republican to Democrat, it didn't affect the types of casework that was being done in the agency, and very little within the department.
Okay. So during your time, did CRS ever face any pressure to, quote, stay in its lane from other federal agencies like DOJ, state or local officials?
Now, well, CRS was pretty much the peacemaker organization, and we had our own carve out. We were expected to be able to respond and be the assessors of dispute and the resolvers of dispute based on the kinds of requirements that were placed on us by the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Can you tell me a little bit about the staffing numbers at CRS when you were there, and what sufficient staffing looks like for CRS?
Ooh. Well, I came to CRS in, like I say, in 85. And I think the agency had lost a number of the original staffing levels that they had previously, and from that point onward, they've consistently lost staff, and basically, I think from a personal standpoint, because of the lack of interest of resolving situations by way of dispute resolution. Okay. When you have attention given to situations that were addressed on the front end and not allowed to fester, not allowed to get to a boiling point where things got out of control. That's what CRS did. CRS would address situations from an assessment standpoint, and they would assist in resolving those situations before they got to a boiling point. And I don't think the various administrations have appreciated the level of work that was done back in those days that allowed societal issues to be resolved at that level rather than waiting until they got to a boiling point. Okay. So consequently, the fact that they weren't appreciated, that meant budgets were cut, that meant staffing levels were cut, and it means that we're down to, the CRS is down to where they are now from a staffing standpoint. I think they're at a level now from a staffing standpoint to where they've never been before. And one of the things that this organization that I was telling you about that we belong to, CRS, remember, We are trying to encourage the new administration to really take a hard look at the staffing of CRS and bring it back to a level of where it can be effective, because there's no question um, the kinds of things that can be done from a dispute resolution standpoint, Bill, from a mediation and conciliation point of view, can be so beneficial to this country.
Absolutely. Do you think at its present low staffing level, CRS has the capacity to do much of that work, or are they running from one fire to the next?
Well, they're running from one fire to the next. I mean, I'm going to give you an example. We are in Region 4 where I live. Okay, I live in North Carolina. And the conciliator that works North Carolina is responsible for all of North Carolina and part of Tennessee and Georgia. Okay, so consequently, that person, one person, is pulled between 3 states. Now he's in North Carolina today, working on a situation that was brought to his attention several weeks ago, and he's doing an outstanding job, but he's still only one person. And we have several situations throughout the state that would command or demand his attention, but he's still only one person. You see?
So what would an ideal staffing structure look like? How many people?
Oh, wow.
How many technical assistance providers look like to you?
The field staff I think the field staff would be the most important, and having those conciliators or mediators out in the field to address the issues that face the nation. Okay. We had a process back in the day. I don't know if they use that same process or not, but of course, the conciliators alert cases. They go in and assess the cases once they're alerted, and then they bring in the resources to address the situation if it rises to the level of resolving. Okay. A lot goes into those 3 stages of alerting, assessing, and then providing assistance. A regional staff, at least you need to have at least 2 conciliators assigned to each state. Okay, at least 2. Now, I don't know what that would look like in terms of overall staffing numbers for CRS, but that's just field staff. And then your headquarters, I don't know if they have an Office of Technical Assistance and Support now, because that office back in the day, you had 2 AOJ specialists. You had an education specialist. That person would go in and assist with casework that was involved in the educational processes. Then you had a journalist. That person worked in terms of issues that didn't necessarily fall into that education or that law enforcement bucket. And that journalist was somewhat flexible that they could go in and deal with casework that was more generic to the agency. Oftentimes, that took on the aspect of extremism. So that person worked a lot with the NAACP and the Urban League and organizations like that to assist the field staff in dealing with cases that they were faced with.
Okay. In your capacity providing technical assistance, did you ever interface with the media in positive or negative, or have positive or negative experiences working alongside or with the media in connection to cases?
Well, most of the cases that I was involved in were pretty much high profile cases, but we were trained not to necessarily get involved with the media, even though the media would follow the kinds of things that we were doing, and we didn't not allow them to be involved with the press conferences or whatever it was that we were doing. But we had a PIO, and that PIO was pretty much the go-to as far as press information, and that person was assigned to our headquarters level, and that person worked in concert with the department's public information officer. So everybody in the department knew what the storyline was going to be coming from the Department of Justice perspective, or from the community relations service of the Department of Justice. So we staffers, we didn't make comments, we didn't give interviews, we referred the media to our PIO.
Great. Do you have any advice for navigating the bureaucracy of CRS and DOJ?
Well, like I said before, I hope that this administration staff up the agency so that the agency can provide the assistance to the nation the way that it needs. We are in some turbulent times now, and I would encourage that again, the work of the Community Relations Service is valuable to this country, and I think if they had the kinds of trained mediators and conciliators that can provide the kind of support to the citizens of this country the way that we did back in the day, it would be outstanding. This young conciliator that we have working with the state of North Carolina now, he's a retired JAG officer. He retired from the Army, came down to Atlanta, and was trained by one of our premier conciliators down there, Tom Battle, and is doing an. I think Tom, Tom. Tommy trained this young man, and he's working with me on several cases here in North Carolina and doing an outstanding job. That's the kind of nurturing and mentoring and you have a whole lot of us old timers out here in the community throughout the United States who are willing to provide that mentoring and nurturing to young people as they come out here and do this kind of work. Yeah.
So what, as a follow-up to that, what sources other than mentoring and finding a good mentor like yourself or Thomas Battles or Ron Wakabayashi or others I can imagine out there, what sources would you advise someone entering this line of work to observe or review or read?
Well, again, for yourself that good mediation a mediation training, dispute resolution training is key. Don't know what institutions are available out there now that provide that kind of training. But the alternative dispute resolution is a resource that anybody that don't want to be necessarily an attorney can get involved in and can do a good job at helping being a dispute resolver.
Great. Good. Thanks for that advice. So you've mentioned a couple of folks who you learned from during your training at CRS and during your time there. Wally Warfield, Ozell Sutton, Bertram Levine. Who else did you learn from when you were working with CRS?
Good Lord, I think we all learn from one another. You know, we had, again, mediators and conciliators, you know, people like Patricia Glenn. Pat was up in Chicago. You know, it was just so many. And again, we learned from one another. Bob Inslee, he was down in Atlanta. Claude Hall, you know, Tim. What was Tim? He was in New York.
Tim Johnson.
Tim Johnson, yeah, Tim Johnson, excellent conciliator. I think he's still doing some dispute work up in the Maryland area. But again, Mike Miguel Hernandez, you know, good guys. Nancy Farrell out in Texas, you know, it was just so many. And like I said before, we all work together and learn from one another.
Thank you for that list. Do you have any, you've sent me some information previously, but do you have any written accounts that you've written yourself with respect to any of the work that you've done with CRS?
No, not that I want to publish right now. I'm working on my memoirs, and I've not gotten to my CRS days yet. I'm still stuck in my my law enforcement days with the police department, but I'll get to that those CRS days soon, I hope.
Well, let me know, please. So one of the question I have a couple of the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you want to tell me about your work at CRS?
I enjoyed every minute of it. CRS for me was one of the best agencies in the department that I had an opportunity to work in. I did a lot of things in the department, but I think my work with CRS was one of the most enjoyable, because I think we provided a level of service to the community that was, and you could see you immediately see the results, the positive results of the work that you were doing, you know. And like I said before, Bill, I've been a gun toter all my life, but the time that I spent in CRS was a chapter that I don't mind reliving over and over and over again.
So can you say just a little bit more about seeing how your work had a positive impact so quickly? Say just a little bit more about that.
Well, I think it was just the opportunity that we got to go into situations that were somewhat volatile, and utilizing the skills and the resources that we brought to the incident or the issue that made the difference in the resolution of the situation and made the difference in the lives that we touched. You know, those are the kind of things that move this country forward and help instill the kinds of trust, societal trust in the systems. Because when you go into a situation and say, I'm from the United States government and I'm here to help, they expect you to help.
Great. Well, James, I'm going to hit the pause button, but first I want to say thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate you doing this follow-up interview. Your perspective on CRS is unique. I think you're the only person part of this revisited project and the original project that's talking specifically about their experience providing technical assistance. And so it's really valuable, and I really appreciate your time. So I'm going to hit pause.